Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second recording. I hope you're all safe and well, and I also hope that you enjoyed the first week of our course. So no one connected on Friday at 11 for a chat on Canvas. As I said, it's not mandatory, so don't feel under any obligation to show up. Let me just remind you of that possibility. If you want to ask questions, if you want to have an extra moment of conversation, you can connect on Friday at 11 and I'm there available to talk to you and answer your questions. So today we begin our block on imperialism. Let me just briefly explain to you why I've decided to devote a substantial part of our course to imperialism. First of all, as the article by Evans rightly points out, empires is the most enduring phenomenon in world history. It has dominated the historical landscape globally for more than 100 years. So in comparison, the contemporary world of nation-states is a recent phenomenon. Imperial polity was, for a very long time, and certainly until World War I, the norm. So there's no way we can study the history of 19th century and 20th century and understand its most meaningful developments and dynamics without fully appreciating the origins and the development of modern imperialism. Imperialism was also a very important space of global governance, a way to organize and discipline international relations and world affairs. There's another reason why we devote time and space to imperialism, because the collapse of the British, the French, the Dutch, the Belgian, the Portuguese empires in the 30 years that followed the end of World War II was one of the biggest geopolitical changes of the modern world. And not only did it transform Africa, Asia, the Middle East, but it also precipitated a profound and cultural reorientation in Europe, political and cultural reorientation. And this has ultimately led to a deep unease about Europe's place in the world, its global responsibilities, and the ideological foundations of European dominance since the 18th century. These tendencies have been reinforced by a huge influx of migrants from Europe's former empires, which is a visible and awkward reminder of a colonial past that most states have tried hard to forget. And in recent years, the imperial past has been often debated publicly when discussing issues like Brexit, for instance, or the Muslim headscarves in France, and the possibility to wear them, the possibility and the opportunity to wear them in public spaces and offices. You will explore the legacy of imperialism in post-colonial societies, meaning in societies of former imperial powers, during the sessions with Nora. But if you have time and if you're interested in knowing about, for instance, the British political scandal of the Windrush generation, you can find a video here that hopefully makes it clear the connection between then and now. And it's also interesting because it concerns citizens of West Indies, which is the focus of one of the readings that you have for today. And it offers another additional example of how international relations can be studied from both from top-down, but also a bottom-up approach. Which leads me to another reason, a methodological reason, why we discuss the rise and demise of imperialism in this course. Because imperialism can be studied in many different ways. The systematic study of imperialism began with Hobsbawm's critique of the economic basis of imperialism in 1902. And in that famous study, we find the root causes of imperialism that developed in later theories. So the competition of industrial capitalist powers, the excess of manufacturers over the consumption power of the domestic public, and the surplus of available capital and goods that drove capitalists to secure distant lands for markets and resources. But over time, scholars have approached the study of the formation and the functioning of the imperial world from different perspectives. There has been what has been called the post-metrocentric turn, which pushed studies in the direction of the so-called peripheries. And instead of focusing on policies and actions initiated from the metropolitan center, greater attention was devoted to the agency of local actors and to the role played by cultural and social factors. A school of thought which you may be familiar with or perhaps have sometimes heard of is post-colonialism. And this scholarship highlights the cultural and ideological production of imperialism and aims at giving greater agency to the colonies and its peoples. We don't have much time to go into details now, nor is the purpose of this course to explore the historiographical evolution of the field. But this is to show you again that there are many ways of studying the imperial world. And this is why I've chosen two different sources that I hope you have enjoyed or will enjoy if you haven't looked at them yet. I'll first say a few words on the rise and development of imperialism, and later in the second part of the recording, we'll tackle the issue of the demise of imperialism. So, as far as the rise and development of imperialism is concerned, you have two readings, one by Bart and one by Catherine All. The first by Bart is, in my view, a solid piece of international history, very well structured and easy to follow. Particularly in the last part, it offers a pretty traditional narrative of why and how the concert of Europe broke down. So in general, it shows you the connection between imperialism and one of the most dramatic events of the 20th century, indeed one of the turning points, which is the First World War. I won't spend time in this recording on this reading. I hope you found it useful to go over some of the basic facts and ideas of imperialism that you should already be familiar with. The second reading offers instead a more original perspective, and it shows you how imperialism can be studied without having our eyes focused on the metropole and on the leading players. So the reading, as you know, is about Governor Eyre controversy, which took place in Britain in response to the Jamaican Rebellion of 1865, the Moran Bay Rebellion. The rebellion was a relatively brief peasant uprising that was vigorously suppressed by very substantial state violence during a period of martial law declared by the Jamaican governor, Edward John Eyre. The suppression of the rebellion was followed by a public inquiry and calls for its prosecution from the Jamaica Committee, headed by John Stuart Mill. His supporters, led instead by Thomas Carlyle, formed the Eyre Defense Committee, and in the end, although his handling of the rebellion was harshly criticized, he faced no legal consequence, despite efforts by the Jamaica Committee to have him prosecuted. The more hierarchical interpretation of racial difference associated with Eyre's defenders became powerful over the same period as democratic rights in Britain expanded, culminating in the Reform Act of 1867, which approximately doubled the electorate. So think of these two developments in parallel. Therefore, more people were fully included as citizens of the nation at home, while abroad, people of African and Asian descent were increasingly excluded from it. So why do we study this controversy? Why is it relevant? What is its significance? Well, the controversy was a substantial turning point in the history of the British Empire. And historians have indeed looked at it and at the multiple discussions of the events that took place in Britain and elsewhere in the imperial world to investigate how contemporaries understood the empire, the nation, the racism, and the relations between them. So when reading the article, you're asked to think about these very important issues, and there are various elements that can help you reflect on them. Take, for instance, the role of the missionaries in the case of New Zealand and the brokering of the Treaty of Waitangi, or think about the influence of the discourse on the Nigger question of 1853 to understand why, when, and how it became not only possible, but more importantly, legitimate for influential men, white men, to publicly express their racist views, to claim that blacks were born to be mastered and can never attain the level of European civilization. Now, the purpose of this article is to, at the end of the day, to explore the evolution of the male middle-class identities of 19th century Britain, using the biography of this particular man and using his imperial experience and experiences in Australia, in New Zealand, in Jamaica, to reflect on that. So you can reflect on the link between the international, the imperial sphere, and the domestic, the national sphere, not from an economic or geopolitical perspective in this case, but from the perspective of the British political culture and the evolution of British identity in relation to the empire. I don't want to say more about this because it's really up to you to do the reading, but I'll ask you to consider these questions and answer at least I'll answer one from this blog. So you can choose one, and here you have the 4 questions that I designed. How do you explain the evolution and transformation of Irish thinking? Why did race become more important after the emancipation of slaves? What were the 2 different imagined communities of Mill and Carlisle? And 1D, examine the source from the Spectator that you can find online in the folder that I uploaded, and consider the nature of the argument and contribution that he makes. How do they attack Airy? What kind of vision of Britain in its relationship to the empire do they present? What is their understanding of the rebellion? So you choose one question and you answer it before Thursday. Now, moving to the crisis and eventual demise of empires, there again I've chosen different sources. The first one, the article by Evans that I've already mentioned, is an overview of the process of decolonization, which I believe can help you frame the question of how the process unfolded, what were its origins, and how it played out for the European colonizers. And it can help you answer a few pivotal questions. You don't have to do that in written form for Thursday. These questions that you find here in the slide that I'm reading now are questions that you should use and bear in mind when reading the article to fully grasp and understand its core arguments. So for instance, how do we make sense of such persistent reluctance to let imperial possession go? Because differently from the traditional and the common understanding, 1945 was not the moment when decolonization started for all the former empires. 1945 was a moment of imperial reassertion. So why did European nations hold on to their empires after World War II? What is the timeline of the process of decolonization, and how did the Cold War influence it? How do we explain that the 6 Western European overseas empires disappeared by the mid-1970s? What were the long-term transformations that enabled such outcome? And it also, the article also introduces, towards the end, the question of how decolonization affected Europe, how each of the former colonizers has been conditioned by the aftermath of empire in multiple ways. So you start familiarizing with concepts like multiculturalism, colonial guilt, and you start thinking about shifting perceptions of international power. But in this short recording, I want to call your attention to the second source, the movie by Gillo Pontecorvo, The Battle of Alger, La Battaglia di Algeri, its original title, of 1966, that you can watch online on YouTube for free with English subtitles. So you just go on YouTube and you write The Battle of Alger and it pops up. Again, same question, why have I chosen it? Well, The Battle of Alger is one of the most influential political films in history, and it vividly recreates a key year in the tumultuous Algerian struggle for independence from the occupying French in the 1950s. The Algerian War of Independence lasted from 1954 to 1962. As you will see, the actors of this movie and the actors of the struggle that Pontecorvo is showing and is giving absolute centrality are primarily common people. So Pontecorvo, himself a communist, was somehow a precursor of post-colonialism, and his intention and his objective was to show the agency of the colonized. As you will see, that as violence escalates on both sides, children shoot soldiers at point-blank range, women plant bombs in cafes, and French soldiers resort to torture to break the will of the insurgents. The will was shot on the streets of Algiers in documentary style, and it has become a case study in modern warfare with its terrorist attacks and the brutal techniques used to combat them. So much so that the Pentagon in 2003, when the United States was challenged by guerrilla warfare in Iraq, decided to host the screening of the movie. A screening that was quite controversial and problematic for how we considered the efficacy, the problematic, controversial, but alluring efficacy of brutal and repressive means in fighting clandestine terrorists. And if you're interested in reading this article by the New York Times, where it talks about the Pentagon, you can click on the link here, you click on New York Times 2003, and it connects you, and it takes you directly to the page of the New York Times. If you're interested in knowing more about the movie, how Pontecorvo became fascinated with the subject, and how the movie was actually made, you can click on the making of the Battle of Algiers, and there's a PDF there, and you can discover more about the movie. I won't say much about it. I won't say more than this because I truly want you to watch it and tell me what your impressions are. We can chat about the movie on Friday for our session, but for our weekly Q&A, I'll ask you to answer one of the following questions. To A, in your view, what are the most meaningful messages of the movie? To B, Pontecorvo wanted to relate a war of independence, the Algeria, that at the time seemed to embody for so many third world nations a model for the course of liberation from colonialism. How is the struggle represented, and in how are its main characters portrayed? Last question, do you believe it romanticizes violent revolutions? Support your answers with strong arguments and specific examples from the movie. Why have I added this last part, support your answers with strong arguments? Because what I've noticed from the first Q&A, the Q&A of last week, you all passed, but some of you wrote very opinionated, subjective answers without making much reference to the text. This is something you want to avoid. All questions are based on the readings because I really want to see how much of the text you have appreciated and what you have understood and what perhaps you have failed to understand so that we can talk about it if there is a need to do so. So please refer to the sources when you answer your questions. Before we conclude, let me just introduce you to Frantz Fanon. In the folder for today's readings, you can find a link to an article, to a reading, which is not mandatory. Let me say it again, it's not mandatory. Take it as an additional suggestion for those of you who would like to know more about this. Pontecorvo himself was very influenced by Fanon, as many of his contemporaries. You may be familiar with him, or you may be not, or you will know more about him in the future. Let me just give you a few information. So Fanon was a central character in post-colonial studies, was a distinguished psychiatrist from Martinique, and he took part in the Algerian national movement. It was one of the most important theories of revolutionary struggle, colonialism, and racial difference in history. His book, you see the front page here, The Rest of the Earth, is a brilliant analysis of the psychology of the colonized and their path to independence. It bears singular insight into the rage and the frustration of colonized peoples, and the role of violence in affecting historical change. But the book's strength rests less on the incisiveness of its analysis than on the inspiration of its rhetoric for many in the decolonizing world. It's a piece of combat literature, as it's been defined, meaning a writing that calls upon the people to undertake the struggle against the colonial oppressors. Fanon looks at the peasantry as the revolutionary actor and the revolutionary class. And by reading him, we can have a sense of the importance of the agency of local actors, the centrality of actors other than elites and decision makers. A central element in Fanon's thinking is the so-called lumpen proletariat, colonial subjects who were not involved in industrial production. So for those of you who are interested in Fanon, as I said, you can read the piece that I uploaded and think of these questions. Using Fanon's reciprocal basis of national culture and the fight for freedom, which is chapter 4 of his Rest of the Earth, and is the reading that you can find online. So you take it as an example of anti-colonial thinking. Why is Fanon criticizing a certain type of indigenous politics? Second question, how does Fanon characterize the relationship between colonialism, African elites, and African culture? Let me say it again. These questions are not mandatory questions that you have to answer. The reading itself is not mandatory. You can do it if you're interested in the subject and if you have time to do more. But to sum up, for our quickly Q&A, you have to answer 2 questions, 1 per block. 1 question of block 1 on the rise and development of imperialism. You can find the questions on slide 10 that I showed you before, and they're all based on the article by Catherine Auld. So please refer to that specific reading when you answer them. The second question is from block 2 on the demise of imperialism, so on the movie The Battle of Algiers that you have to watch before Thursday. Try and meet the deadline, not try, I have to meet the deadline, so I want to see all the answers uploaded before noon next Thursday. If you have any questions or doubts, don't hesitate, reach out to me. I'm more than ready and happy to help you. That's all for today, and have a nice week. Stay safe and stay home. Bye.